Well, Jesus really did it this time. You remember he had argued with them about the washing of hands. Could you approach God if you hadn't washed your hands? But now he's gone beyond that. He is teaching and eating with sinners. This is horrible to the Pharisees. And they muttered about it. He eats. You know, you only eat with people usually that you really like. And he was eating with them because he loved them. Well, they were muttering it. It reminds me of the story I told you the last time I was here. It seems like 20 years ago. But one of our pastors, James Ponder, was in Dallas pastoring. I believe this is a little bit too loud. Are y'all going deaf hearing it? Okay, you can all hear it. He was pastoring in Dallas when President Kennedy was killed. And of course everyone was grieving. And he, after a few days, they found out that a man named Oswald had shot the president. And he went to church, and the secretary said, you know, I believe that Oswald was yes, we had him on our prospect file. I've looked it up. We were supposed to visit him. And then he talked to some other people. They said, yes, he lived right over beyond the church, and he walked through our property every day to go to school. And he couldn't believe it. And he pulled up in front of the church, and the church authorities were standing on the front porch, and he came up to them and he said, did you know Harvey Lee Oswald? He was a prospect for this church. He had visited here. He walked through our property. And they said, yeah, and we're glad he never joined here because we don't want that kind of people here. Think how history might have changed if one Baptist church had reached one young man when they had the chance, when he had visited them. But they seem like the Pharisees, don't they? We don't want that kind of person with us. They don't even wash their hands. So Jesus says he will answer. He will answer their problem with 3 stories. Jesus always did this. And you always found yourself in the middle of the story when he got through. That was the clever thing. He told these to tell what God was like and why he ate with sinners. Now, what God is like is a very important question, because if you believe in God, that he created all this, but that then he went off and doesn't care what happened to you or anything else, the universe is just a big clock. Well, if you believe that, then you're not going to pray to him or want him or be part of anything he's part of, because he's gone. So what God is like is second in importance to does he exist? What kind of God exists? And Christ is explaining this. He's the one that loves ones. It doesn't have to be a big group for him to die for. He'd die for you if you were the only person on earth. He believes in ones, not just crowds. One sheep, one coin, one son. God is interested in that. So, Jesus then begins telling the stories. And he makes another point. I want you to hear this now during the sermon. However you got separated from God, he still loves you. Now notice this. The first got separated because of what they were like, the sheep. I never knew it. Do any of you know a shepherd? Okay. I know one shepherd. He was in my church in Virginia, in Stanton, Virginia. He had a big group of sheep. And I went to visit him one time. The sheep were everywhere. and they had numbers painted on them. I said, the little sheep, the little lambs, and the mothers. And I said, what in the world have you painted numbers on sheep? And he said, because the mothers are so dumb, they don't know which ones were born to them. And that's the only way we can keep them together. We put the numbers together, and they're all together. Until that time, I thought it was more of a compliment that we were called sheep. But he said they're really not very smart. We have to really take care of these sheep. So here is a sheep. I have met people like this not too long ago that they don't know about God, they don't care about, they've just never thought about him. They just sort of munch their way on through life, and they look up and, my word, there's no one else here. They live like that. I really do. One of our greatest theologians, Moltmann, converted after World War II in a prison camp, he said his family, a highly educated German family, had never been to church once in his life. He had never been. So people do that. They just sort of wander around and never find God. Now, the man goes out, he finds the sheep. He must have counted them at least 2 or 3 times to be sure that there were only 99 there and one was lost. He found it, came back, they had a celebration. Christ said it's like that when you return to God, there's a celebration in heaven. It lights up. That's it. So that's the first one. The second one is the lost coin. The wives usually wore 10 coins around their head, sort of as a neck. But she had lost one, and it was obvious. And in these days and times, they had dirt floors and no windows in the house. That's why she had to light a light. And she had to sweep it. Now, I do metal detecting. And I want to tell you, when you drop a coin in sand, unless you have a metal detector, it's hard to find. It disappears. At the beach, you've dropped coins, and you never found them when they hit in the white sand. Well, here she was digging in the sand because it was precious to her. A dark home, and it was precious to her. Well, Jesus came into a dark world and brought light and found us, and we found him. Now, I like this. The part of, she has a party too, and they rejoice. I was asked to preach revival in Virginia years ago. This was way back in the 70s. And I went, there were a lot of young people there. And one night, one of the young people came down and said, I'm going to trust Christ and start walking with God. And we welcomed her, and the service ended. And the young people came all around her and said, let's have a party. Janet's come home to God. Hey, will you get the Coke? You get the chips. Gets this. And they kept naming things. Where are we going to meet? We'll meet at Sam's. Yeah, we'll be there. Let's go. And they went out of the church rejoicing to go to a party. I went to it. That doesn't happen very much. And I was really excited. They just loved her and hugged her and said, she's home. She's home. She's really part of us. Now, the lost coin happens because somebody else made a mistake. I know people that are lost because of the family they grew up in. When I was in seminary, they told us that the group before us, several years before us, they were assigned to go to one of the worst parts of downtown Louisville and give Bible studies to these poor kids and all. So they went into this home, which was crowded with children and adults. And one of the young men got up and said, children, I want to tell you first of all that God is your Father. And a look of terror came on their face, and you could just see how upset they were. and they crawled under the bed when they heard that God was their father, because they had a father that beat them and abused them. And they didn't want any kind of God that was like their father. And there are people that are lost not by their own, but by the actions of other people or other churches or 100 other things. This coin was lost because somebody else caused it. Now the third one is the son. He had freedom to go and be lost. Freedom's an interesting thing. You can give your freedom away and get captured. You really can. I had a young man, young teenager, about 15 years old, in my church it's several hundred miles from here, so you won't know which one it was. But he gave his freedom to drugs, and he couldn't get away. And all of us who talked to him did no good. He knew more than all of us put together. And he would walk by our street, and the expression on his face was, I've got it made and I'm doing what I want to do. But he was doing what the drug wanted him to do. And I had his funeral, because one night he took an overdose and he was gone. Now he thought he was free, and he was for a while. He was free to choose the drug. But he had no freedom to get away from it. He had given it away with it. Now, this son wanted to get away from old dad. We don't know why. He just said, which was an insult then, I want my inheritance means I wished you were dead so I could get it now. So will you give it to me? It's a very serious thing in Hebrew thought. And we don't know why he left. Maybe he's, like I've joked before, maybe he said, this town is so small that when I plug in my electric razor, the lights dim. My dad doesn't even have Blu-ray equipment in the house. We've got an old wind-up Victrola. That's it. My dad's, he's yesterday. And I want to get out of here. I want to spread my wings and fly. I want my freedom to do what I want. And it said he got everything together. And that word is very interesting, because you can't take land with you. He sold it, got the money out of it that old dad would never have in retirement if he needed it, and left. And Jesus said in one verse, he got it all together. He went to a far land and squandered everything. One verse, Jesus tells what he did. Now you can imagine when he got there what he did. He bought the newest chariot with the sleekest horse. He had big parties at his house. He did everything he'd ever wanted to do. And then the economy went south and he had nothing. Now notice, he had invested his freedom wrongly, and in the end, he had no friends, no money, and he didn't even make a good beggar. Nobody gave him anything, they said. He'd failed at begging. And so he went to a Gentile and worked with his pigs. That's the most hideous thing a Jew could do. Two of them worked for a Gentile and worked with pigs. And he got so hungry, he wished he would have eaten the pods that the pigs had. And nobody helped him. Nobody. And then it says he came to himself. It's like coming out of a bad dream. He suddenly did it. They asked one man, what changed your life? He said, one day I stopped and looked in the mirror and I didn't like who I saw. He didn't like who he saw. And he got to thinking, my father has lots of food, has a place to stay for his hired men. They eat better than I'm doing now. I'll go home and tell my father, Father, now listen to what he says, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like the hired men in the field. I just want to stay alive. So he starts back. You know, this is like going to your class reunion. You know how you go to your class reunion? Well, I got to lose a few pounds before I get there. He had lost all the weight he needed to. He was starving. And you get some new clothes because you want them to remember how sharp you really were in high school or college or whichever one. But he goes home reciting this. Now, I've got to get this down. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He's rehearsing this over and over again. And here he comes to his reunion in rags. It's a bad scene. But it says a long ways off, the father saw him. You know why the father was looking for him? Because anybody could have killed this young man for going against his family and his religion, and no one would have said a word about it. And it's still true in Israel. But the father saw him coming, and he did what no Hebrew father would do. He went running. Jewish fathers are more like Charlie Chan, the Orientals. They move with dignity and they don't move fast. He didn't. He ran, and with his skirt flying open in humiliation to everyone else, he ran down and grabbed his son. And his son started to squeal. Father, I've sinned against heaven and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And he stops him right there. And he says, I've heard enough. Stop, quick. Bring the best robe we have here and put on his rags. Who owned the best robe there? The father. It was his robe he was putting on him. He's bring a ring. He's going to have some authority in our family. Bring some shoes. He's not a slave. He's my son. I don't want another slave. I don't want another worker in the field. My boy's home. That's who I wanted. And he hugs him and kisses him, and that wouldn't have been done. But if you want to know how God looks at you, that's exactly how he looks at you. However you've been lost, when you return to him, you know his love and you feel his warmth. That's the way it is. And so Jesus was teaching them, I am come for sinners because God loves them, and I'm going to die for them. See? That's it. So, however you're lost, you're welcome to God. One final story, almost my favorite. Fred Craddock was a great Methodist teacher and professor. I love his sermons and his works. Well, he said he was teaching in Oklahoma and he got a vacation finally. And someone kept the kids. And they went up in the Smoky Mountains to the Blackberry Inn. Oh, he said, you open that menu, it's endless. And we were looking over what we were going to have, and an old man walked up and said, do you mind if I sit down? What could I say? He said, I said, yeah, sit down. And we tried to look at the man. He said, I want to tell you a story. I was born in these, and he pointed out at the Smoky Mountains. I was born there, and nobody knew who my father was except my mother. Nobody in town, I didn't know. And he said it was so hard for a young boy. I would go into town on the wagon with her, and the men would look at me and then look at the other men and try to figure out who the father was. And he said when I went to school and we had recess, I would always go off by myself and eat my lunch because the boys were always making fun of me. Yeah, look at him. You know about him. You know about his father. Yeah. He said, there's only one thing in my life that had some meaning. It was a church, an old church. And he said they had a minister in there. He was tall, big, deep voice. He said, I loved the man. Just loved him. And he said, but every Sunday I came early and got into church so nobody would stop me. And when it was over, I dashed right out the door so nobody could make fun of me. But one day, he said, after the sermon, the aisle got crowded and I was stopped. And there was a hand on my shoulder. And it was the preacher. And he said, boy, I know who your father is. It's God, because I can see the family resemblance in your face. Oh, he said, I left with a different feeling. And Dr. Craddock said to him, what's your name? And he said, Hooper. Hooper. Hooper, he said. There was a 2-term governor in Tennessee who was an illegitimate child. He said, I'm that man. I was born that day again when he touched me. That's it. And I want you to know that when we were in Europe as missionaries, a group from Tennessee came through and told me all the rest of the story. They said, not only was he a great Christian governor, but his children became great politicians too, Christian politicians. Yeah, he's real, they said. That's all true. Now, I don't know how you got separated from God, whether you just sort of wandered away, or whether somebody did something that you said, I don't want what they have, whatever, I don't know. I'm telling you, it's time for you to come and claim your inheritance. Now, it really is. God loves you that much. However you got lost, you're welcome now to come. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. We invite you to do that. We invite you to say, it's time for me to come home to my Heavenly Father and His children, these people in the church, and enjoy His forgiveness and His presence. As you make this decision, I'm going to be down front to welcome you with joy. And if you're here and you don't have a church home, I've been here about a year, and I can tell you these are loving people that will welcome you in. So as we sing, as God touches your heart, you come.